What's good, everybody? Welcome back to Big Nate Review. It's your boy Big Nate, and today's video is going to be about a lot of different things, but it was inspired by a historical event really that just took place today, where Charlie Kirk, who is a very prominent right-wing political advocate, was essentially assassinated because this was like 200 yards out from bro literally got sniped. We're gonna talk all about it, but so we're gonna get a little bit into the details of that event, but like there's nothing I'm gonna mention here that has to do with like the actual reporting of it. We're just gonna talk about that and lead it into some larger ideas, kind of like some reflections, interpretations I had in wake of the event that have to do with two main kind of, I think, reactions. The first one kind of being some reflections about like the philosophy of life and Stoicism and how to live, and so we'll get more into that, but also this more kind of historical philosophical idea, like drawing on people like Tolstoy, William Shire, and them. But there seem to be these cycles in history where every once in a while there is like this period, things seem to like brew and brew and brew, and eventually there's this breaking point, and there is a disproportionate amount of extremely historic, influential events all seeming to happen, kind of take place in a very condensed period of time. So we're going to get into all that, but before we do, let's talk about the actual event that took place that kind of inspired this whole video, which is that if you're somehow unaware, Charlie Kirk, who is a very prominent, millions of subscribers, one of the top right-wing advocates right now, is basically, buddy with Trump, had a major part in getting him elected, served as like an actual kind of like advisor, and seemed like he was working his way into the actual administration. Now, if you're familiar with Charlie Kirk at all, he's a very inflammatory, controversial figure. Honestly, I think his politics are pretty reprehensible. I disagree with virtually everything he has to say, but at the end of the day, I never would have wished death upon this man. And what happened today was just he was doing kind of like this run-of-the-mill event where he'll go to college campuses and just debate college students and like own them and whatnot. That's really his claim to fame. And so he was doing one of these in Utah where he just like very pretty much right after the event got started, ironically enough, he was being questioned about the acts of mass gun violence. But apropos of nothing, he was just in this really horrific video. He was sniped. From the details we do know, as of right now, as of me recording this, 2 people have been apprehended and questioned but been subsequently released. So as far as I know, the shooter is still at large, but that motherfucker had to be military, because this took place from, like I mentioned, about 200 yards, which is like 2 football fields, and this was a sniper like right into the jugular. I don't know exactly where bro was aiming, but to hit him that precisely that far is like some military grade skill. Another interesting aspect of this whole thing is this is an extremely recorded, televised kind of event, and there were anyone who kind of knows what happened, you probably have seen the video, like the close-up video of the point of impact. You can just see his whole body go slumped and his neck just starts like spewing, leaking blood. It was it's some serious business, and I honestly feel like the corporality of it, like the physical body seeing it all, at least for me, is partly what inspired some of the reactions I had, which was that like, so the first one, there's 2 main ones, like I said. The first one was more almost like a personal stoic, just almost, it's gonna sound a little corny, but just like an appreciation for life. Like I distinctly remember after he was pronounced dead and I was taking my dog on a walk, I was just like, yeah, that's crazy. This figure who was so important, he's around my age. I believe he died at the age of 31. I'm 28, and it's just like, that's crazy that a few hours ago this was not the case, but like I'm alive right now, and that man is dead. I just honestly had like a renewed sense of, I guess, like gratitude or appreciation for life, the fact that I am alive. And this is the Stoic philosophy, and I know this sounds dramatic comparing all this to like a political assassination, but I want to bring the Stoicism into here, because it really is the case for each of us that any given day, for the most, because this was yes, Charlie Kirk was like a prominent media figure, had controversial stuff, but nobody would have guessed that he would have been assassinated in the jugular like that. The point is that every day truly could be your last, and this is a fundamental Stoic principle. And the fact that your life is finite and that you don't know when it is going to end gives you cause to genuinely cherish it and to live your life to the fullest, because you never know when, by the most seemingly improbable chances of history, your life may, at any day, right, it may come to a final end. In one way or another, you might get done like Charlie Kirk, where your life has just been completely extinguished. And again, this has like an urgent need, at least for me. It's like, you know, when you really think about it, I found myself kind of reflecting on this, knowing all this about life, that it really could end at any day, at any given moment. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as political assassination. Many of us, I'm sure, have had experiences where just because of the situation, or like we had, you know, narrowly missed something, have had kind of like near death experiences where of just like almost getting hit in a car accident, or a surprise medical condition, or, you know, so many different factors that speak to the principle that, like I said, your life could end at any given day. But just in light of this whole thing that took place, I found myself kind of reflecting, and especially on, because of like, you know, the finitude of life, it's so important to ask yourself the questions, you know, what is it that you ultimately want to get out of life? What is it in life that brings you joy and spiritual satisfaction? These are questions that we should, you know, be thinking about constantly. And whatever it is, right, that brings you joy, that gives your life purpose, that is something that you need to go towards. That needs to be the sort of the North Pole of, in the Stoic sense, of how you choose to live. These are the most important questions of life, and they really deserve our attention now while we still have the chance, before in one way or another we end up like Charlie Kirk, who at this point his life has completely vanished. So those were some of the thoughts I had, just like kind of on the personal, more introspective side. But there's a whole other strain of thought I've been having, which is related to just like almost like an observation of history, where it seems like throughout time there are these periods where the historical, cultural kind of landscape just brews more and more, and there's like this buildup of pressure. But, you know, are relatively, in terms of like outwardly historical events, relatively tame. But there's a sort of breaking point that gets reached where it just seems like there's this endless succession of historical events, and it feels like we're living in a modern version of one. But just to give a little bit of like historical context that comes to mind for me is a famous year in history, 1968, where again there have been ton of social and political tensions brewing. But you get all sorts of crazy things that happen in this one single year. You get the assassination of MLK Jr., the intensifying conflict in the Vietnam War, the resignation, like historic resignation of LBJ. You have the Kent school protests where student protesters were actually, you know, physically killed by police force. There were the DNC riots in Chicago. Robert Kennedy, of course, was also famously assassinated in this year. So it was just like, you know, back to back to back to back of like each of these events would have been historic in their own right, and the fact that they just happened in such quick succession to one another makes it like this whole other thing. And I mentioned William Shirer and how I've been reading The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. There's something very similar that happened with the rise of Hitler, where just in a matter of a few years, this basically, like, he was like a bum, literally. Like, he was a impoverished, he's described as like like an Austrian tramp who somehow makes his way into the highest positions of power in Germany. He becomes chancellor. He ends up dissolving the German government, and within a few, all this happening within a few years, he takes over the Rhineland, he takes over Austria, he takes over Czechoslovakia, Poland, each of these being momentous historical events in themselves. But again, it's just this, like, what I'm trying to say is just point out there's this phenomenon, it seems like, where societies and cultures will kind of like, the pressure will increase, and then there's this rapid succession of events, and it feels like we're living in something very similar now. And I would argue that kind of began with the first election of Donald Trump, who at that point was a known charlatan, reality TV star, bankrupting businesses, bankrupting casinos, ripping off old people with the Trump University, known and have, you know, numerous reports of him starting like a beauty pageant and then like barging in on the underage girls while they were changing because he owned the place. This is, you know, the grabber by the pussy convicted of rape guy.
And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy.
And I guess the point is, you know, however you lie on the political spectrum, it's undeniable that the election of someone like Donald Trump was totally unprecedented in history. Then we have the worldwide COVID pandemic. In the meantime, mass shootings, school shootings, all of these have just been rapidly increasing. Just recently, we had the event with Luigi Mangione, where he just allegedly murdered in cold blood the CEO of United Health. Another one that kind of comes to mind is the deportation of Abrego Garcia, which was, you know, ruled by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional, and they just said fuck it and did it anyway. The very recent unprecedented use of the National Guard to just, you know, lock down a bunch of different cities, which mirrors very similarly a tactic that Hitler used in his rise to power with the SA, which was basically the predecessor for the SS, but critically it was a paramilitary group. Paramilitary being like essentially like an unofficially kind of functioning military, which is unanimously what's happening happening here with the National Guard. Not to mention, of course, like the attempted assassination of Donald Trump that took place, and of course now here bringing it back full circle, the successful assassination, you could say, of Charlie Kirk today. It just feels like we're in the middle of one of those periods where history in some sense begins to, it almost seems like it's a principle, just when things get a little too dry, history needs to stir the pot, and it feels like we're in the middle of the pot being stirred right now. And if history is any indication, there's a lot more to come from here. It's like the Chinese curse that's allegedly said, may you live in interesting times. And if anything could be said about this day and age, I think it is safe to say that we are indeed living in such interesting times. So anyway, let me know what you guys thought about any of the stuff we discussed. In the meantime, follow me on Instagram at Big Nate's Book Reviews, and thank you guys so much again for watching the Big Nate Review.